In this video, we're going to talk about culture in a more globalized context. You've heard of the term cultural appropriation very often. We are going to talk about a systematic framework that will allow you to understand the nuances of the term cultural appropriation before you decide to judge that it's good or it's bad. The term cultural appropriation itself can be defined as the use of a culture's symbols, artifacts, genres, or rituals by members of another culture. So simply put, if you are borrowing something from a culture that is not your own, you're engaging in what is called cultural appropriation. But it's not as simple as that. If you think of that definition, cultural appropriation can be a lot of things. There are 4 different types of cultural appropriation. I'm going to walk you through each of these and give you a few examples that will help you make sense of what constitutes different types or acts of cultural appropriation. So let's look at the first one, cultural exchange. As the label indicates, cultural exchange is essentially a voluntary exchange between two cultures. The term voluntary is very important to note here because this implies that both the cultures who are involved in the act of the exchange have agreed to partake in the exchange itself. Both parties benefit from it, so the benefits are mutual, and usually an exchange happens between two cultures that are at roughly equal levels of power or status, whether that is in terms of political or economical power. An easy example of cultural exchange is consumption of media across the borders. So Japanese anime and manga is becoming very popular in the United States. You can see it on Netflix or Hulu. At the same time, US popular culture is heavily present and consumed in Japan. So this is an example of two cultures that are of roughly equal power that are engaging in a voluntary exchange of culture. Another example on a more interpersonal level might be an intercultural marriage, for example, where the bride and groom partake in each other's cultural rituals or costumes or traditions as a means of understanding and accepting each other rather than using these traditions as a prop. So these are examples of mutual cultural exchanges. The next category of cultural appropriation is cultural dominance. This one tends to be a little more problematic than the first one. Essentially, cultural dominance is not two ways, it is unidirectional, meaning there's only one culture whose components or elements are being forced upon another subordinate culture. Now, when you think of this dominant-subordinate relationship, dominance can be established by many different ways. So it could be that one culture has greater political, cultural, economic, or even military power. And so the idea of cultural dominance is that you're imposing the elements of your culture onto a subordinate culture so that you retain, maintain, or sustain the hegemony or the power of your dominant culture. A severe example of this is the use of English and how a lot of American citizens now subscribe to this idea that in order to be American, you have to speak English. In October 2015, Asma Jama in Coon Rapids, Minnesota, was actually attacked by a woman in Applebee's for not speaking English. Asma is of Somali heritage, but is a US citizen. However, this idea that she has to speak English to be recognized as an equal American is an example of cultural dominance, whereby you're enforcing this uniform or blanket rule for everyone to subscribe to a specific standard. Another example across the borders can be the fact that a lot of Asian markets, the beauty industry heavily markets products that focus on European standards of beauty. For example, fairness products are very common in countries like India or China, whereby you have skin lightening creams that allow you to attain that European beauty standard. At the same time, double eyelid surgeries, again, big eyes, which is a traditionally European feature, is heavily imposed as a beauty standards in many of the Asian countries, and the result of that being that a lot of women feel the need to get a double eyelid surgery to make their eyes look bigger. So these are both examples of how the values of a dominant culture are imposed onto a subordinate culture. The third type of cultural appropriation is cultural exploitation. Now, as the term implies, there is some manipulation going on for the benefit of one party in this type of cultural appropriation. This is when a dominant culture borrows from a subordinate culture and uses that act of borrowing for their own benefit in some way. The exploitation could mean a lot of different things. It could either be distorting the subordinate culture, it could be perpetuating misinformed stereotypes about the subordinate culture, or it could be using the elements of the culture for own personal benefits without really having the benefits trickle down to the subordinate culture. A classic example of this is use of cultural elements in the fashion industry. So this is a picture from Valentino's show in the Paris Fashion Week. As you can see, all the clothing and the jewelry or even the hairstyles are heavily inspired by the African culture. The theme of the show was Africa. However, 95% of the models in this runway show were actually white. This is a classic example of using elements of a historically marginalized culture for one's own capital benefits. Other common examples that you might be familiar with is the use of cultural elements as costumes, whether it is Halloween costumes or whether it is accessories at a music festival. All of these instances constitute a behavior whereby you're not really asking for permission, but you're sort of assuming that you're entitled to use elements of somebody else's culture and use that as something that is exotic, that is fun, and that is a costume merely, and disregarding all the historical or the cultural context or the meaning that it holds for a given community. The last and final category of cultural appropriation is what we call transculturation. Transculturation essentially means creation of a hybrid culture that has elements of two or more separate cultures. So essentially the hybrid entity that is created as a form of this mixing belongs neither here nor there. The important cultural elements essentially take on the local features as the cultural hybrid develops. A lot of the examples of transculturation can be found in different industries that are involved in the creation of these hybrid products that sell across different markets. A classic example would be General Tso's chicken, something that we know as Chinese food in the United States. If you actually went to China and asked people if they know about General Tso's chicken, the answer would be a no, because General Tso's chicken is something that is a hybrid between the Chinese and the American culture. It is a dish that came as a result of tweaking the Chinese cuisine to adapt to the American taste buds. Similar examples can be found in menu items for McDonald's or other big corporations that always try and incorporate menu items that are catered or adapted to the local tastes in the market to which they want to sell. Another example of transculturation is K-pop, which is Korean pop music that is truly a hybrid between the American boy band culture as well as some of the traditional Korean folk music. And so as a result of the two, what is today known as K-pop is truly a hybrid between the Korean culture and the American culture. It is truly westernized in a sense, so it can't be truly Korean, but at the same time, it is not completely American either. So we've looked at 4 different types of cultural appropriation acts. We've looked at cultural exchange, which is a mutual exchange, voluntary exchange between two entities. Cultural dominance, which is the imposition of the dominant cultural values onto a subordinate culture, cultural exploitation, which is using elements of a subordinate culture for the benefit of a dominant culture, and transculturation, which is truly a hybrid between two or more cultures. So, as you look at examples of culture in the world around you, you'll find that some acts are more problematic than others. But while you're evaluating these acts, I want to invite you to consider 3 questions as you look at mixing or borrowing of culture. First of all, is the cultural group voluntarily involved in the act of borrowing? Meaning, do you have permission to borrow? Do I know about the historical or contemporary power relations between both the cultures? And finally, who's benefiting from this? So the next time that you hear the word cultural appropriation, don't judge it immediately as positive or negative, but apply this fourfold framework to really examine the nuances of the context.